KFSR and CMAC present the Central Valley Ledger, a public affairs program featuring stories from all over the Central Valley with Sevag Tateosian, 90.7 KFSR.
Welcome to another edition of the Central Valley Ledger. We're recording out of the beautiful Community Media Access Collaborative Studios in downtown Fresno. Today's interview is brought to you by Skype because the gentleman I'm talking to is in Orlando, Florida, but he has a connection to Fresno, and I'm going to let him tell you about that. Brian Turner, musician, poet, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on the show, Sevag. I was born in Visalia, just down the road, and then I was raised partly in Fresno. I went to Vinland Elementary School, and then we moved out in the country across the river to Bonadeli Ranchos. So I went to Madera High School eventually, and I graduated as a Coyote. And then I started at Fresno City College, was an English major. I went to Fresno State, studied English too, and poetry with Connie Hales and Chuck Hanselcheck and Phil Levine and some of the greats there. The program's really blossomed there with their MFA program. And now I'm an MFA director of a creative writing program of my own in Lake Tahoe. And I live in Orlando, but it's a low residency program. So like the students, I go there twice a year in January and in August for the classes. And then the rest of the time I do the work remotely.
You know, I was looking on your website, which, by the way, what is your website?
Well, I've got a couple, and there might be more than that, but maybe just to get us started, I have an author website, which is brianturner.org, and then I also have this project, an album that's just come out with the interplanetary.acousticteam.com. So that's interplanetary.acousticteam.com. So those two, there's one for the writing mostly, and then one for the music. Yeah.
And the reason I asked the question is because your website is full of information. You're a poet, you're a musician. You're a teacher. Am I missing anything else?
Well, I'm a veteran, so I served in the Army for 7 years. I served in Bosnia as a NATO peacekeeper, and then also in Iraq as an infantry sergeant for a year in Iraq. I've done a wide variety of jobs throughout my life, trying to live an interesting life just like everyone. So it's an adventure.
Incredible career you have, and it sounds like you're still doing some wonderful things. You have a connection to KFSR. We have audience members listening to this on KFSR right now. Tell us your connection.
Well, you know, when I was a student at Fresno State, I got an opportunity to be a DJ there. So I was the blues DJ on Monday nights from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. So if those listeners, it would have been pretty hardcore to be up at 2 to 6 a.m. But I did my best and enjoyed being in the studio and learned a lot from the process. I was also in a band at the time called the Dead Guys with some friends of mine that are, sadly, one passed away, my best friend, Brian Voigt. He was a guitarist and one of the most creative people I ever met in my life. And he died of cancer in 2012. I'm working on a future project that will include a lot of his music. And I'm looking forward to coming back and see what you think of that, too.
So, Brian, how did you end up in Florida? Because, you know, you're at Fresno State, you were at KFSR, and then what happened to make you decide to go to Florida?
Well, there was a sweetheart here called Elise Kuznets, poet Elise Kuznets. And so I met her while on the road as a poet and fell in love immediately. And then very quickly we started living together and eventually got married. It's hard to bring up because there's so much joy in it, but then also I don't even know how to talk about it, but she passed away from cancer in 2016. And so that's what's led to the recent project. But she's the reason why I came here and also put some roots down here as well.
Sorry to hear about that.
I appreciate it.
So you get to Florida, and then were you working on poetry and music at the same time, or what were you doing?
I was doing some music in the background. There's another website I won't bother you with a persona where I was writing as a Dutch poet and a musician, and there's a whole album that's already ready to go to vinyl, but it's on standby right now. But I was working on poems, and my second book of poetry was coming out in 2010 at one point, and then after that a memoir came out too. So I've written 2 collections of poems and a memoir.
let's talk about, and I'm glad you brought it up. I was going to ask you about it later on. Let's talk about the poems right now. So, where are you coming up with the poems? I mean, what's your style? I guess is a better way to ask the question.
I on the surface, it looks mostly kind of a lyric narrative approach, which I think people, if they looked at it on the page of the flip through, they would think of it as free verse mostly. I think there's a lot of there's craft and there's form involved in it, but it looks like free verse for the most part. But I think each poem and each project and each book, we're trying to grow as human beings and as artists. And so when I approach a new project or a book or even an individual poem, I may have my intentions, but usually the thought process, the meditation takes over, and I'm often surprised by what happens at the end of it. So there may be a given form that I'm working with, but if I'm true to Robert Frost's maxim, which is no surprise in the writer, no surprise in the reader, no tears in the writer, no tears in the reader, then I can't superimpose too much in the beginning or in the middle of the creation process. Oftentimes in revision, that's where more form gets involved, because I'll start to shape something once I have an idea on the page or record it on tape.
Is it common for you to start with going one way, and then by the time it's done, making a complete U-turn and talking about something else?
I've had very different. How do I say this? I've had almost the opposite reactions happen. Meaning, I've had where something just came out very quickly, boom, and it was on the page, and that's exactly how it is in the book. That's rare, but it's happened on occasion. Usually, what happens is if I'll write for 4 or 5 pages or 3 pages, and I'll get 2 lines, and then those 2 lines will start over. I'll start over with them, and then a whole poem will come out of that. So it's oftentimes a sort of a cyclic process of sort of working my way through an idea until it really forms itself on the page and in my mind.
Let's pause right now, and we'll play a brief segment of one of the CDs that you sent, and we'll come back and talk a little bit more about writing, music, and much more, because you have a lot of knowledge and information to share. Okay, we're back. We hope that the audience members enjoyed that tune. Want to remind you that we're recording out of the beautiful downtown Fresno studios of the Community Media Access Collaborative in downtown Fresno. Our guest is with us via Skype, has roots in Fresno and the area, but he's talking to us from Florida. Brian Turner is his name. Brian, welcome again to the program.
Oh, thanks for having me back. I was looking at your office there, and mine is so cluttered. I feel like I should share some of my stuff to put in your office.
I look at your office, and what I'm seeing is a very intelligent man, active, because you got books, you got records, you got a good variety of stuff there, from an instrument, books, you've got records, and then you keep it fun with target practice, I see.
Yeah, I've got I forgot that was up there. Yeah. Sometimes I just have to kind of mull an idea over it. It's fun to just throw the darts. Yeah.
Let me ask you about writing. I'm a fan of writing, and that's when I saw your website and some of your poetry, I thought this is going to be a great interview. Writing, are you seeing that writing is a skill that's being lost, or are there still people who can make a living writing? Because I asked the question because at one time, we're in Fresno, you had Soroyan, you had other great authors that made a living doing this.
It seemed for a while that it was waning, but I actually think there's a resurgence right now in America. And there's a new wave of writers, especially poets, coming up. Some of them are at Fresno State right now, for example, and because they just hired several new poets there, for example. And around the country, there are writers in their 20s and 30s and just pushing into their 40s, and that wave is going to have 40 or 50 years. It's going to make a huge impact on literature that'll be written about in the next century. And I think some of the writers at Fresno State right now will be a part of that, because from my experience and looking back, just like you said with some of the writers you listed and some of the ones I mentioned before, the Valley is a wellspring of literature for America. I think it's one of the biggest and deepest pools of literature in America. It often gets overlooked because people look to New York and to Chicago for publishing, but where the words are being written and where hard things that need to be said are being put to the page is oftentimes right there in the Valley. And I'm proud to be a writer from the Valley. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about how people can get stronger in writing. I know that practice makes perfect, but in your opinion, if you have people listening and watching this broadcast now who are not confident with their writing, and I'm asking you the question because I hear it all the time. Occasionally, I'll submit something to the Fresno Bee as an op-ed and it'll be published, and people are like, well, how, why are you so comfortable, or how are you so comfortable writing? There are good writers out there that I think maybe are not confident in their work.
Yeah, I think for me, I try not to repeat myself in the work I do, so I can lean on the things I've done in the past to help me have the sort of fortitude to push forward into a new project. But it always feels like it's on the verge of failure. And sometimes it does even afterwards, because a lot of things don't work out. I think of Ichiro as a baseball player, and I think he's one of the world's greatest people at getting out. Like, he's failed so much, like more than anyone, but he also, because of that, he was able to succeed more than anyone else too. And so it gets back to that hard work at the desk or wherever it is that you write, if you compose aloud or if you compose on the page or on your computer. I think part of it's writing. A lot of people will say being voracious readers, because I think that's really helpful. And by voracious, I mean reading broadly across the work that you can get, but also if you find a writer that you really love, try to read them from front to back, like from their first book to their last, and get a sense of the arc of their career and how they developed as writers. Because if you read that way with intention, you can often see a writer growing. And then it might give you ideas about how each of us might also develop ourselves as writers over the course, book by book by book, over a lifetime. But I think there's one thing most people don't say, which is it's kind of connected to the blues, and that's part of it is just like getting out in the world, just like have a life, fall in love with people, have friendships and struggle and have jobs and these things. Everyone already has a childhood if they've made it through childhood, so they already have enough to write about for a lifetime. But as they mature and get older, they'll have so much more to write about and things to learn about, and that we can learn as readers and listeners, appreciating their insights. We can learn through their work valuable things that help us with our own lives.
Brian, when we come back, I want you to talk a little bit about some of the music that you do. But first, let's listen to a brief segment or a brief song that you've written.
Great. Sounds great. Thanks.
Maybe we're inside the brain of God, whose neurons are stars. Maybe it's about perspective. We control the past by viewing it from the future. We entangle the past, our total consumption of a particular moment in the past. And this, not that, happened. Because I cared. We cared. The past, born from a star somewhere when this quantum moment became a particle and not an uncertain, swirling wave. I'll always be watching you go.
Welcome back. So tell us a little bit now about your music. I listened to a few tracks, Thank you for sending that.
My pleasure.
And is it electric or there's something different with your music? I like it. And I'm saying different in a very good way because I started listening to it and I'm like, wow, this is catchy. So tell us your style.
Well, the bands I played in there in Fresno, we played at Zapp's Park and sometimes the Cadillac Club, which I'm not sure is still even open. But those are rock bands, and those were like hard rock bands at times, and they evolved eventually into sort of like experimental alternative rock bands, I'd say. But this is not that. I'm sure you recognize that quickly. Although on Amazon it was charted as alternative rock, and it shot up to number 69 in the world at one point. So I'm sure there's some pretty angry alternative rock bands, because I think it's more electroacoustic in a sense that there's a mixture of synthesizer. And when I say synthesizer, I used to have a tick. I was very much against and opposed to synthesizers. Felt like a fake kind of cold sounding music, and it's something from the 80s that hung over with me. And I really wanted, guitars and rock and roll and drums. But with the content and the theme, and again, this gets to that question of form you asked earlier, to try to approach the problem and the questions that were being asked inside the narrative, the story of the music, I had to make sure that the instruments responded and were the right ones to answer the question. And so in this case, it's really about technology and cybernetics and the uploading of human consciousness and things like that. So I really had to go to an electric world, a digital world, where robots exist and computers and things like that. So instead of, when I say synthesizer, I'm not talking about keyboards where you can visually oftentimes see the keys like a piano, but really talking about being inside the synthesizer, the circuit boards with patch cables and things like that, and taking an electric signal, amplifying it, and then putting different types of filters on it and sequencing in ways where you shape and modulate the sound. So at the end, when it comes out of the speaker, you hear music, but it's all handcrafted synthesizer music. So to get to that, maybe a better way to answer your question is some people might know like K-rock, or that they call krautrock, which I'm not really comfortable with that phrase, but some of the sort of experimental modular synthesizer work of the past few decades. I went back myself into the 1950s and 60s with the Dutch experimental electronic musicians like Tom Dissevelt and some others who maybe, I'm not sure how many people are into that, but my point being, I tried to learn a lot from them to try to answer the questions that the narrative was posing. So when you listen to it, what you hear is all the words are my wife, Elise Kuznets. Those are her words, whether they're spoken or sung by me or someone else. Oftentimes it's her actual words, her voice, from recordings that were taken over the last 20, 30 years. We just cherry pick to find on this theme, and then she narrates the album that we create a sort of sonic landscape for.
Do you think, well, this is going to be a tough question, and I'm going to put you on the spot, but I've listened to a couple of songs, and I did hear a female, and I was impressed because it was very catchy. What do you think she's thinking right now if she was here?
This isn't the kind of music. I think if she was flipping through the dial, I don't think she would stop on this channel of music if it was like if you go to Pandora and you put in a radio and you make that station. But I think if she listened to this album, I think she'd really like it. I think she'd be surprised by it, especially since, in a sense, it's very much a spoken word album. But the voice is really part of the music, so it doesn't feel like that awkward thing where it's like a poet and the musicians and they're sort of smashed together in one project. It feels very fluid and it feels very symbiotic. And I hope she would find it beautiful. I know there are a couple of parts that would be pretty jarring, but hopefully she would get past those.
Tell us what the album is called. Where can people find it?
Oh, sure. It's by the Interplanetary Acoustic Team. The album is called 1111 Me Smiling. And that's from one of her poems where she says, "In case I forget to tell you, 1001 is binary for a sigh. 1111 is me smiling." So that's where we got the title of the album. And anyone can find it on It's streaming on iTunes, Pandora, Spotify, all the usual download sources. But also, if they want a hard copy like a CD, or today, in fact, they just landed from Germany, and I had to get a broker to free them from U.S. Customs. But that's her, and that's the inside of the album. It's they can find it on the website, interplanetarayacousticteam.com, and they can buy some beautiful blue vinyl.
So you also have this available in blue vinyl?
Starting today. And here's where it's really connected to Fresno and to the Valley. The band I used to play in, one of the guitarists and a lifelong friend since elementary school, since Vinland Elementary School, Bill Toole. He's an artist. He's connected to a comic book store there in Fresno. He's one of the owners. And he's an artist of many types. One of the things he did is he made 11 original prints that we've created. It's a limited edition. He signed all of them, and one of these goes into each. There are 11 different types of these, so this is one of 11. So if you buy an album, you have a 1 in 11 chance of getting, well, you'll get one, but you'll get one of the 11, if that makes sense. So the art is connected to not only with me, but another Fresno artist too, which is Bill Toole. Yeah.
That is very creative. So tell us who would be a fan of this music. I mean, who is your target audience?
You know, I think my biggest hope would be, and this is too much to ask, but my biggest hope would be that someone who has lost someone they love might find, even if they don't like the music necessarily, they might see in this project a way to do something special, because I'm hoping that this is not just a celebration of Elise and not like sort of like an added tombstone or memorial added to her sort of epitaph. What I'm trying to do is, like, part of the reason we have her words all the way through it is so that her words narrate the journey. We have to respond to her. So it means that we're collaborating with her. And so she's still making art. And I would hope that someone who listens to this might find either a way forward into their own process of grieving and maybe collaborate and continue to be in conversation with their loved ones. And also for those who just love music and just want to be on a journey and be surprised by something that's not the norm.
Now let's stop and play another track from your album, and we'll come back and you'll tell us where to find it, and we'll wrap up the program.
Dispatched from server 4511984.2001.2013, location Epsilon Tower, route Palm Reef, final bot status conditional, 12.13.2085, press code Emmet, set code MET, conduit, Ungarit.
We're back. By the way, I called it Brian Turner's album. Actually, I should have mentioned the band. So what's the band?
Yeah, it starts with Elise Kuznets. She's featured, right? And we're collaborating with her. But it's called the Interplanetary Acoustic Team, which is myself. There's an amazing bassist and engineer here in town who's just phenomenal named Benjamin Kramer. and also Jared Sylvia, aka Pressure Wave, who's a modular synthesizer. He's like one of my mentors, really teaching me about modular synthesis. And then that I would say that's the core with Sunil Yapa, who's a novelist and a guitarist, an amazing composer and musician who's in Mexico City at the moment. And then from there, there's a wide variety. This is why it's difficult for us to play anywhere live, because there's an opera singer in Cologne, Sarah Kasabun. She's in Germany. There's a singer, Cameron Desmond-Hammond, who also has albums of her own in Houston, Texas. There's it goes on and on. Stephen Leithley is a guitarist who plays on the album. So there's several people, and I should say there are two bands that play with us who've added incredible things. One's from Sweden. Their name is Hello Ocean, and they do some wonderful work on the album. And then the Parkington Sisters, who are out of Wellfleet, Massachusetts, they were so kind to join in the project. I contacted them because they were one of Elise's favorite bands, and they were so kind to add their voices and their music to it, so that at one point on the last song on the album, Elise is narrating part of the journey, and they're singing backup for her and playing along with my acoustic guitar and stuff.
Brian, thank you so much for being on the program this week. I would love to have you back and chat with you some more, because there's so much more we can talk about. Every song and every collaboration, but we're out of time this week. Thank you. Good luck to you. Where can people find out more information about you?
Sure, they can go to brianturner.org with an I, brianturner.org, or the interplanetariacousticteam.com. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you, and thank you for being here, and we wish you the best from KFSR and CMAC, and we'll be back in touch with you.
Thanks, Sevag. Take care.
That's all for this edition of the Central Valley Ledger. We're recording out of the downtown Fresno studios of the Community Media Access Collaborative, Fresno and Clovis, here in downtown Fresno. Our guest joined us via Skype from Florida, so from one coast to the other coast. Hope you enjoyed the program this week. Thank you for tuning in. Tune in next week to a new edition.
KFSR and CMAC present the Central Valley Ledger every Sunday morning at 11:30. For a complete program schedule, visit kfsr.org.